Welcome to our epic ocean, where critical solutions to a planet in peril are brought to the surface. Our epic ocean celebrates all that is epic about the ocean and why it is the planet's most vital resource. And now to our host, Rich Gurman.
On April 20th, 2010, a damaged pipe on the Deepwater Horizon oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico exploded, killing 11 people and leaking oil and gas on the ocean floor about 42 miles off the coast of Louisiana. By the time the wellhead, sitting 5,000 feet below the ocean's surface, was capped 87 long days later, an estimated 3.19 million barrels of oil had leaked into the Gulf. The result was devastating. We all saw the images of pelicans covered in oil, fish belly up in brown sludge, and smothered turtles washed up on beaches. And there was also the long-term effects not seen by the naked eye. Strandings of both dolphins and sea turtles surged. The reason? Lung disease, stress, and compromised immune systems. Post-spill, only 20% of pregnant dolphins in the area successfully carried their babies to full term. 1 million coastal and offshore seabirds died. Fragile coral reefs were decimated. Countless fish killed. And 1,000 miles of shoreline were negatively impacted. Recovery is ongoing and will take years. My guests today share a deep passion for protecting the ocean and have committed much of their efforts towards initiatives to transform decommissioned oil rigs like the Deepwater Horizon into artificial reefs, providing many benefits to the marine ecosystems in which they stand. Amber Sparks and Emily Hazelwood, co-founders of the Blue Latitudes Foundation, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having us. Happy to be here.
I'm so happy to have both of you here today. So I believe you both had direct experiences in the Gulf after this tragic event. Amber, can you tell us about the work you did there following the BP spill?
Well, you know what? I actually didn't get my hands too dirty in that specific spill, but I know that Emily did, so I'll let her speak to that. Yeah, so right after undergraduate, back in 2011, I had an opportunity to go and work on the BP oil spill as a field technician. I'm originally from the East Coast. I'm from New Hampshire, so I'd never seen an oil platform. I'd never witnessed the devastation that can be wrought from one. So the entire experience was really eye-opening for me. As a field tech, we were basically collecting water samples, sediment samples, biota samples, trying to understand the full extent and impact of the spill. Now, you'll remember the BP oil spill happened in 2010, that spring. So this was a year later, and we're still working on the spill, trying to understand the full extent of the contamination. And what was unique about that time was that BP had hired many of the fishermen that could no longer fish because of the closing a lot of the fishing grounds because of the oil spill. And every time we would be out there, they would every time we go by an oil platform, they'd be like, man, I cannot wait for the weekend so that I can go out there and go fishing off that platform. And at the time, that just seemed so bizarre because here we are, at the site of one of the largest man-made disasters of all time, trying to reconcile the disaster caused by an oil platform. And yet they're saying they're unbelievable hotspots for life and they can't wait to go fishing and eat the fish that come right off those platforms. And so that was the first time I learned about the Rig-to-reef program and what a unique program and how important it is to the people in the Gulf of Mexico.
That's incredible. And obviously we'll talk a lot about Rig-to-reef. So Amber, what led to the two of you meeting?
Emily and I met at Scripps Institute of Oceanography down at UC San Diego. And we were both there for our master's degree in marine biodiversity and conservation. And when I heard about Emily's experience in the Gulf, I said, well, here in California, we actually have 27 offshore oil and gas platforms. And growing up here in Southern California, I've seen them from my beach chair. They just look like menacing industrial giants on the horizon. And I thought, could there be reefs beneath those structures? And if so, are they valuable fish habitats? Who knows? So that's kind of the beauty of graduate school is you get to dive into these questions. And so Emily and I teamed up. We did a joint thesis on investigating the implications of reefing California's platforms from an economic, ecological, and social perspective.
It's incredible. So then in 2018, you co-founded Blue Latitudes Foundation. Is that kind of how that all came to be? And how did that unfold? Obviously, you had the intention to explore innovative solutions to conservation challenges. What led to the creation of the nonprofit?
Definitely. So when we graduated from Scripps back in 2014, we actually started Blue Latitudes LLC, which is a for-profit marine environmental consulting firm. And a lot of the work we were doing at the time was very nonprofit focused, but it's really hard to get a nonprofit started. There's a lot of upfront costs. You have to get lawyers involved. And so for the first 3 years, we actually partnered with Sylvia Earle's nonprofit, which is called Mission Blue, and they were our fiscal partner. So through that partnership, it enabled us to seek out granting opportunities, accept donations using their tax exempt status. So we were able to do education, outreach, exploration from a nonprofit perspective using that partnership. And then by the time 2018 rolled around, we had a lot of momentum behind our work, and we were able to start our own foundation at that time.
How exciting was that, having Sylvia Earle herself back what you were doing when you were just kind of fresh out of school, right? That's incredible.
Exactly. Pretty cool.
Well, I saw your interview with her. That was just a couple weeks ago, so we'll definitely talk about that. But I want to hear more about rigs to reefs. Turning oil rigs into artificial reefs is obviously a unique idea. Who originally came up with that?
So we didn't come up with that concept. It's been around since the late 1980s in the Gulf of Mexico. I believe the first platform was reefed in 1989, somewhere around there. So it's been around for 30 years. And since that time, the Gulf of Mexico has reefed anywhere from 500 to 600 offshore oil platforms. It's not just in the Gulf. This program's starting to take off internationally. We see programs developing in the Gulf of Thailand and in Malaysia. So it's really starting to gain traction on an international scale. But basically what Rig-to-reefs is, when an oil platform comes to the end of its useful life, when it's no longer going to be used to extract petroleum, oil company operators in the Gulf of Mexico have a choice. Do we want to totally remove this structure, take it on shore and scrap it, or can we leave a portion of the structure in place to function as an artificial reef? The structure that's left in place to function as a reef, all of the drilling infrastructure has been removed, and all of the wells that are associated with that platform are sealed and capped in the exact same way as if they were going to be completely decommissioned. So all that's left really is the jacket, and the jacket is all the beams and cross beams, kind of like if you've ever seen the construction of a high-rise building, the scaffolding, that's really what it looks like below the surface.
Okay, so we'll dive into what you guys are doing in California, but first, I want to know a little bit more. Why is turning oil rigs into reefs important? What are the real world benefits to the ocean?
Well, you know what? It's hard to imagine that these structures have a beneficial environmental impact, especially considering like what you started out talking about, the massive oil spills. A lot of the incidents that have happened that make our perception of offshore oil and gas development really negative. And this idea of repurposing them as reefs is it's come from the fact that once those structures were put in the water column, they started to attract life. So some of these structures have been offshore for over 40 years and have amassed incredible ecosystems. Not on purpose. This is obviously not the intent, but now they are thriving reef ecosystems. In California, there's been decades of research on these structures, and they find that they're actually some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet, which is a massive statement for something that's been put offshore to produce oil and gas. Yeah. And so the reason why we are looking to repurpose some of these structures as reefs is because they have thriving reefs growing on them. And we believe the future of ocean conservation is to think, kind of creatively about these resources that we have and how can we preserve and protect those that are significant.
Beautiful. So how is a rig even reefed? What's the process?
So when it comes time to reef the structure, what they'll do is there's basically 3 options to reef a platform. You can either tow it to a designated reefing area, which is commonly done in the Gulf of Mexico, where they'll say, at these X, Y, and Z coordinates, we're going to designate X amount of acres for reefed platforms, and they'll tow it there and place it there. or
Right.
you would remove the upper 85 feet, and that allows ships to safely draft over without colliding with the structure, and they'll leave it standing in place, or they can totally topple the structure onto its side. There's pros and cons with each of those methods. Some work better, and honestly, it really needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, because a platform that's in 85 feet of water, you're probably not going to remove the upper 85 feet because you'll be on the seabed. So for a variety of reasons, each of those methodologies will work better in different scenarios.
So it's case by case, depending on location and everything like that. Okay, so beyond the obviousness of ecosystem destroying oil spills, what other harms do these oil platforms create for the ocean?
Yeah, they're definitely not a perfect solution toward, to remediate, let's say, the degradation of our nearshore habitats or anything like that. There are some cons, and some of the major ones we've seen are invasive species. So sometimes we've dove on these platforms in the Gulf and we see lionfish or orange cup coral, which are two invasive species. And they've done some research on this, and what they found is that these platforms are acting as stepping stones, creating corridors for the spread of invasive species, but they're not doing it at a rate any greater than our natural offshore reefs. However, it is something that needs to be taken into account. Of course, there are some other cons associated with, leaving these structures in the water column. Exactly what is the lifespan of this type of a structure? And the truth is that we don't really know the full answer to that question. We can look at things like shipwrecks that have been in the water column for maybe, hundreds of years, something like that, to get an idea of how the materials corrode over time. They've done a couple estimates on this, and they assume that it will be about 300 years before any of these structures would require maintenance once they've been reefed. But, these are cons and things that need to be discussed in advance of actually reefing these structures.
Very good. I want to talk about coral reefs a little bit. Share with us, why are preserving coral reefs so critical to the overall environment, and how do they impact fish and the whole animal kingdom?
Well, coral reefs are really important because, from a very basic fact, they provide just even hard substrate, meaning like a rocky surface. Of course, coral reefs are living hard substrate, but the idea of having something that's a hard surface in the ocean is actually comparatively rare. Most of the ocean is an empty sea floor bottom. So these coral reefs, not only are they living, but they provide habitat and homes for a variety of other fish species. And they really create these unique metropolises of life. You'll have multiple species that either they live full time on these reefs, or they come and visit the reefs from the depths at night to go and hunt on these reefs. But they're a critical part of the ocean economy as well, just from a fishing perspective, but they're also a critical part of the health of the overall ocean in general. There's not going to be any coral reefs in the future that's going to be extremely detrimental to our oceans, and there'll be a massive extinction event that would be associated with their loss.
Absolutely. Amber, anything you would add about the importance of coral reefs?
Well, I think it's also important to think about how our reefs are kind of in danger right now because of raising temperatures and climate change. What we're finding is that the coral reefs are bleaching around the world, and that we're seeing a lot of degradation of these natural reef ecosystems. And so now more than ever, we know things about how these reefs are responding to climate change and pollution. And with that knowledge, now's really the time to take some action towards protecting those ecosystems. So it's a really critical moment for ocean conservation.
Yeah, I've been saying for a long time now, this is an absolute all hands on deck moment for sure, which is why I'm excited to be here with you guys today and just hear what you guys are up to. It's so important. Emily, you mentioned earlier, I think you said that there's 27 oil rigs off the coast of California. Is that a correct number?
Yep, that's it.
And then how many are there in the Gulf of Mexico?
Honestly, there are hundreds, perhaps well over thousands of platforms. It's hard to put an exact estimate because the industry is so active there. They're constantly building new structures, moving structures, taking them down. In California, that number is a lot more easy to quantify, just being that there's 27.
That's a tiny number compared to thousands potentially in the Gulf.
Yeah.
You mentioned your nonprofit. I have a nonprofit also, so I can absolutely relate to what it takes to put that together. My nonprofit, Project O, we have a program called the Blue City Network, where we are certifying cities for following best practices when it comes to protecting the ocean and for being true stewards of the ocean. And we consciously decided to start by focusing on coastal cities here in California, and then we're going to move inland and globally. And we made this decision knowing that the eyes of the world are always on California, and the cities that we are working with, we feel can really serve as a model for the rest of the world to follow. Decommissioned oil platforms, as you mentioned, have been reefed in other places around the world, but if I understand correctly, never in California. And I know there's been resistance to what you guys are trying to do. So why is this? What's the potential downside? And what have you been able to accomplish here in California since you started the project?
Well, the culture is very different in California. As a state, it's, I'd say, one of the greenest, most environmentally friendly states in the country. But we also have a rich history, a long history with oil and gas, which most people are surprised to learn that. But California, actually, offshore oil and gas began in California before the Gulf of Mexico. They used to use redwood trees off of Huntington Beach. And the structures that we have are some of the oldest and the deepest in the world. Now, they're not the most productive platforms anymore, and there's only 27 of them. So it's not sort of the culture that we get in the Gulf of Mexico, where everybody knows somebody that works on an oil platform. But it's created a very unique and long history in California, especially with some of the negative events that have happened, such as the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill, or even more recently with Veneco filing for bankruptcy after their pipeline burst. So I think California has more of a fraught and a negative relationship with oil and gas, and especially because, we're a large state, but we only have 27 platforms. There is not familiarity with those platforms. There's not familiarity with the ecosystems associated with it. And only a small portion of Californians have ever even been up close and personal with one of these structures, which is so different than what we see in the Gulf of Mexico. In the Gulf of Mexico, it's really a part of the lifestyle there. And they also really understand, just from all the fishermen, how productive these platforms are. But I do think that perception has slowly been changing in California. I think it used to be that everybody saw things very black and white. Oil is bad, this is good. Let's get our oceans back to the way they looked 2,000, 5,000 years ago. And of course, who wouldn't want to go back to see what our oceans looked like before the impacts of humankind? I mean, that would be ideal. But that's not the reality of our oceans today. It would be nearly impossible to do that. So what we've been advocating for, and I think what a lot of people are starting to recognize, is that we're all partially responsible for those platforms placed offshore. If you've ever used plastic, if you've ever driven in a car, if you've ever ridden on a bus, if you've ever used rubber, you're responsible also for those platforms offshore. It's going to be very difficult for us, even though we slowly are, to totally remove ourselves from petroleum resources. It's a slow process. But I think what a lot of Californians are starting to recognize is the value that these platforms have from all of the incredible science that's gone on from UC Santa Barbara and from local fishermen that are starting to access and recognize the resources that these platforms provide. That perception of just get oil out, get rid of these platforms is slowly starting to change. And I think another unique change that's coming to California that's really going to impact that is the reality that offshore wind is coming to California. Now, offshore wind is a much cleaner energy than offshore oil, but the concept of having a large structure offshore in the ocean it's not natural, and it's something that we'll need to think about in terms of management. So I do think that cultural position on how Californians should manage their offshore resources is slowly changing, especially as all this great information that's come out revealing how productive these platforms are, not from a petroleum perspective, but actually from a biological one.
I think you bring up a great point. It's so easy to just blame big oil for the problem, but I think what you're saying is we got to take personal responsibility. If you drive a gas-based car, if you're using plastic, rubber, like you said, et cetera, we're all part of the problem, right? Exactly.
And I think it eventually, in the question that Amber and I often wrestle with is, We're not dealing with and recommending keep drilling, keep building more offshore platforms. We're talking about what do you do with this structure when it's no longer productive from a petroleum resources perspective? What's the best way to recycle that? And what is the way to recycle that in a way that has the least environmental impact?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't get it. Well, I don't see the downside. To your point, it's not like you're working with the oil companies so that, oh, we can put more platforms out there. That's not what you're saying at all. You're dealing with what's already out there. What am I missing? What's the downside?
Well, I think a lot of the negative perception here in California comes from this idea that artificial reefs should be placed based on ecosystem need. And these structures were placed offshore to produce oil and gas. They weren't placed to accommodate a specific ecosystem need. And therefore, They can't be valuable reef habitats. So that's one idea. Another idea is that these structures are impeding historic trawl grounds. So trawl fishing is a type of fishing where you have a big net the size of a football field that you drag along the ocean bottom, and it can be pretty destructive. But that being said, it's an important fishery and it needs to be, respected and accommodated. And so historically, trawl fishermen have been anti-rig-to-reef because these structures are in the pathways of some of their historic trawl fishing grounds, and they want access to that. However, as Emily mentioned, we're actually starting to see a shift in how the commercial fisheries are viewing offshore decommissioning. They're starting to value these structures in a new way, and so that perception may be kind of dying out a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine that save the oil platforms isn't as sexy and as much harder to market than save the whales, right? Is that the case?
Set up a booth of save the oil platforms right next to a booth that said save the whales. I mean, I wouldn't want to sit at that booth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Longer line and save the whales, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's been pretty challenging for us to, as a foundation, secure, grants from these different institutions that are funding ocean conservation initiatives for that exact reason. But we do have one patron that really has been leading the way and providing a lot of funding for us over the past 5 years, and that's Patagonia. We've been able to secure several environmental grants with them and working directly with their team out of Ventura that, look at these platforms every day. Some of their employees are surfing the waves with the oil platforms in the background. They're connected to the environment in which these oil platforms are. So it's important for us to engage with those different funders and, these groups that are looking to conserve the ocean and help them to think about ways to conserve it in a different way.
That's great. So that being said, what's the big picture goal with Rig-to-reef specifically here in California?
I think for us personally, it's definitely not that all 27 platforms should be reefed, because not all 27 should be reefed. The ones that have been evaluated and proven that it would be a better environmental option to leave it in place, we would love to see a Rig-to-reef reality here in California. And we firmly believe that it should be. There's a more of an environmental benefit of leaving some of those platforms in place. We think it would benefit more stakeholders, and we do think there'd be an environmental benefit resulting from doing that. So long-term goal would be to see some of California's platforms reefed. And as this program starts to take off, not just in the United States, it's well established in the Gulf, but it starts to take off internationally. We believe that this is something that can really take off in California and set an example for many other areas.
Yeah, kind of like we were saying, the eyes of the world are always on California. What's a realistic goal for getting, it sounds like if you could get one done, that would be a great step forward. How realistic is that, and what's your guess on how long that could take?
Well, you know what, it's really hard to say at this time because California has a Rig-to-reef law. It was signed in by former Governor Schwarzenegger back in 2010. But one of the issues with this law is that it doesn't specifically address where the liability of that structure will lie. Now, in the Gulf of Mexico, Department of Fish and Wildlife take over the responsibility and the liability for the structure, and they manage it as they would any other artificial reef. Now, mind you, the oil well itself is always the liability of the oil company in perpetuity. So should there ever be a spill or a leak or anything like that, they're always responsible. But what we're talking about is that platform jacket that's been supporting the marine life. Yeah. So with that, without having a clear transfer of liability, it's difficult to know how this is going to be implemented here in California, and if it will, how it will be successfully managed. And it's important to also talk kind of about the economic side of things, because our Department of Fish and Wildlife here in California is severely underfunded. We used to have an artificial reef program, but we don't anymore because they don't have the funding to manage it.
Yeah.
With the Rig-to-reef program, there would be a significant amount of funds that would come back into the state to an endowment for marine preservation and conservation. According to the Rig-to-reef law, currently 65% of any cost savings that the oil companies would reap by reefing their structure would go back to the state. And that would leave 35% of the cost savings with the oil company stakeholders. Now, this number has been estimated and by a couple of economic gurus here in California, and they estimated that if 23 of California's 27 platforms were to be reefed, there would be over $1 billion in funding to the California Endowment for Marine Preservation and Conservation, which would go to fund things like the Department of Fish and Wildlife, ocean science and conservation programs at our local universities, nonprofits throughout the state. This would be a critical influx of funds that could be really valuable to the state. So that's something to keep in mind, and definitely an incentive for the state to get involved.
So say that again, if 23 of the 27 were reefed, that would create $1 billion in revenue that could be a lot of good could be done with. That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, so based on that, what are you doing beyond research and raising awareness from an educational standpoint to engage communities on all things related to this so that this could actually happen?
Well, we are doing a lot of outreach and educational work to talk to our local communities about the issues around Rig-to-reef. We want to be as transparent as possible because this is not a perfect solution. There are pros and there are also cons. There are things that we don't have the answers for. But when we look at what the alternative is of complete removal, we are hoping that, Californians are really smart. If we give them the information, they can make the best decisions possible. And, if we talk about moving up the food chain, thinking about our legislators and the ability they have to permit this type of reefing, no legislator is going to jump on board with this program unless their constituents are in favor. And so through this sort of grassroots educational effort, we're looking to inform people and get them on board.
Kind of a bottom-up and top-down approach at the same time?
Sure, yeah.
Got it. So let's shift gears a little bit. I think the three of us all share another major passion, and that is humpback whales. You both traveled to Tonga to swim with them and also to meet with the locals there to discuss the shift from whalers killing these sacred animals to now making a living off of ecotourism, with visitors coming from all over the world to swim with them. I want to hear about your experience there. First off, had you swum with humpbacks before this trip, and what was it like for you?
No, neither one of us had ever swum with a humpback whale before this trip. I'd never even heard, I'd seen them on whale watches, but I never heard them underwater. It was one of the most unbelievable experiences of my life. It on every single level. And what was most unique for me, at least, about swimming with these whales was how human the interaction was. It was the most human-like interaction in the natural world I've ever had. You understood the emotions that transpired between the mother and the baby, and the baby wanting to come and play with you and engage with you. You understood them on a level that I'd not ever experienced before in the natural world, and especially in the ocean world. So from that perspective, it was a really unique experience. And we really got ingrained within the Tongan culture, which I think also added another unique layer to that experience, from working with the locals on the island it was one of the few Tongan-run whale watching experiences that you could have. A lot of them are run by foreign-owned entities. And even getting to go to the village of Hunga, which was home to one of the last remaining tribal members who had actually hunted humpback whales, and learning from him and what his perspectives were as to why they did that, why it was important for them, and how they feel about swimming with the whales now. So it was a really unique experience for us, and it's something that I will certainly carry with me forever.
I recently interviewed Captain Paul Watson, and I was telling him about an experience I had in the Silverbank. If you love Tonga, you got to go to the Silverbank off of the Dominican Republic and swim with the humpbacks there. And I told him how on the final dive on the last day, I had an experience of staring this baby humpback in the eye, and it was just that entire night, I was speechless. I can't even speak about it now. I was just literally just bawling in tears, and it was just such a powerful thing. Amber, what was it? We'll talk more about the Tongan people, but we gotta stick on just the whales themselves for a moment. What was it like for you, Amber?
Yeah, I think we had many similar experiences. It was really kind of like being on an underwater safari. I couldn't believe that we were able to be in the same, proximity with these massive and, highly intelligent species. It was really, really cool. Definitely a very humbling experience. And I think at least, the work we do is a lot of it is desktop based. We're in the office working, and we do have, of course, the occasional dive, get offshore, but this was one of those moments that reminds me about why I work to preserve and protect our oceans, because there are these incredible animals that call it their home, and they don't have a voice to go out and speak and protect it themselves. So it was one of those kind of reaffirming moments, and one I'll never forget.
Right. Yeah. It's like you're changed in a way, and you'll never go back. You guys are right up down the road for me, by the way. I'm out on the water every day, so you guys need to come up and we'll get out there together. You got to get behind that, away from the desk and computer for a while. Obviously, to each of us, the idea of creating a living by taking tourists swimming with the whales is way better than slaughtering them. Yet I imagine whaling was not only a way to put food on their table, but also a big part of their heritage. In fact, hunting them was legal and a main source of locals' income until 1978, when the king declared a moratorium on whaling inside the kingdom's waters. Emily, tell me, you started saying a little bit, but tell me, what were the people of Tonga like? Since humpbacks are migrating animals who only spend a short time in Tonga each season, what did you discover related to ecotourism being a sustainable practice?
Yeah, Tongans, they have a very complex relationship with the humpback whales. For me, it was personally very interesting to learn and think about the fact that the village elder, the one who was the hunter, he said, was our source of income, and we haven't replaced that source of income. And now people only come to Tonga to swim with the whales. A handful of people will go there for windsurfing, but really, there is beautiful diving there, but, people see Fiji is much closer, so they'll stop off at Fiji. Rather, they'd like to go there for the whales. So it's, balancing an economy on one, vulnerable species that, doesn't spend its whole life in Tonga. These whales are migrating up to, from Antarctica all the way up to Alaska. And during those journeys, they face a lot of other perils, and there's always that looming threat of what if the whales don't come back? What was unique after talking with a lot of our Tongan contacts that we've maintained connections with is, and we explored this in our documentary film, is, we thought about what if the whales don't come back, but then COVID hit. And it was, what if the people don't come back? What do you do for income? And it was something that we had never considered at the time. No one saw this coming. But it ended up being, a really unique conversation, and really made those conversations that we had with the locals so much more meaningful, because they talked about this as an issue. They understood this was an issue, and especially because so many of the licenses that are given out there are maintained by foreign operators. So, Tonga in and of itself is vulnerable as a country. It's, low-lying, well over 100 islands that are very vulnerable to sea level rise. They're very vulnerable to plastic pollutions and pollutants in our oceans. It's difficult to get any sort of resources there because it is so remote. And so at the same time, the people that were there were some of the kindest and warmest people I've ever met in my life. They welcomed you with open arms, and they love Tonga. They love Tonga. They look at it like, why would you ever want to leave here? And you got it. You're like, you know what, honestly, I could live here. I like this. Like, this is nice. But you think about how vulnerable they are. And you think about like, you know, a lot of their younger generations, more and more increasingly, they're leaving to make an income in Australia and abroad because there just isn't a future in Tonga. So it really raised a lot of interesting questions for us. You know, they had successfully pivoted from hunting the whales to conducting this ecotourism operation, but it's still extremely vulnerable.
It's so gorgeous there. Obviously people like us would want to come to swim with the whales, but I would think there'd be year-round tourism there. How come that's not happening?
Well, I mean, I think another reason is there's not like a resort to speak of. I mean, the people that go to Tonga, you have to be okay. It's, you know, the accommodations are comfortable, but it's more like you're not going to Disney World. You know, you're not going to stay in a luxury hotel.
That's my point. Sign me up. Right?
It's very remote and it's rustic. And that's also part of the success and beauty of that area because it hasn't been exploded like that. So how do you develop a source of income in a way that's sustainable and in a way that maintains that authentic integrity that is the Kingdom of Tonga?
You mentioned that the majority of the whale watching licenses are owned by foreigners. I'm assuming that means a lot less profits for the local economy. Does this seem fair to you, and what can be done about that?
Yeah, it does not seem fair to us. That was kind of one of the biggest challenges, was understanding that this new industry of ecotourism, they were hoping to have it be a primary source of income for the Tongan people. But if you're giving all the licenses away to foreign operators, then that's not the case. And the Tongans are going to suffer. And what we found is, you know, the group of locals that we stayed with, while during the whale watching season, they were guides and operated their own tours. On the off seasons, they left the island and they went to Australia or New Zealand to do other work. And that was the only way they could survive, was by supplementing their income with this other work. So now you have your young and enthusiastic Tongans leaving the island, and that's not good for any community.
No. And I would imagine also with foreigners owning the licenses, this means a lot more daily tours. How regulated is it? And are you concerned that there's going to be too many people in the water and the whales might eventually not return? Is that a concern?
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with, you know, one of the most sensitive, you know, regions of the planet when you consider this is where the whales go to give birth. And this is where they're having their babies, and this is where they're mating, and this is where they're gathering. And, you know, from that perspective, it's a very sensitive area. You know, I can't speak to the other operators because we didn't spend time with them. I do feel like we made the right decision to go with a Tongan operator because the entire time they were incredibly respectful of the whales. You know, they would time it if it was too much time, or if we came up on a whale and they said, you know what, there's too many operators here, let's go somewhere else, they would. They were incredibly respectful of the whales and of not stressing the whales out. And, you know, from that perspective, we did get to even see other cool things at that time, because if it was too many people on a whale, we'd go do something else. One day we swam with sperm whales, never swam with another whale before. I'm sure we got two different whale species.
That worked.
Yeah. So, I mean, they were incredibly respectful of the whales. They understood, you know, what was appropriate, what wasn't appropriate. At times there were a lot of operators on the whale, and it did make you feel like, I don't know if this is right at times, but I can speak to our Tongan operators, and they were highly regulated and very respectful of the whales. And, you know, even just getting permits to film and take photographs of the whale was not easy to get the permits to do that. So it is, from that sense, highly regulated.
That's good. One of the things I like about the Silverbank is there's only 3 permits that exist. So when you go there, there's going to be 3 boats tied up to moorings and about, I think, 17, 18 people max on each boat. And it's a massive area. So there's never going to be more than like 50 human beings in this huge area. And it never feels like the whales are being crowded, because obviously, and that's an issue here in California, as you know, you'll have one whale out there, especially during gray whale migration season, or even when the humpbacks are here. You could have one whale and there could be 10, 12 boats just all around the whale, which is that's another beef of mine, but we'll save that for another day. So sticking with Tonga, you mentioned your documentary film. I'm going to botch the word. Is it said whaka apa apa? Am I close?
That's it. Yeah, it's good.
Oh, good. I practiced that all day. No, what does this word mean, and what does it represent to the Tongan people?
Whaka apa apa means respect in Tongan. And that's a very important word because, as Emily mentioned, it's a part of their culture to respect not only each other, but the land and the ocean that provide for their communities. And so we chose that as the title of the film because we found that one of the things we really took away from our time in Tonga was respecting nature and having that be sort of a critical point of how you interact is from a place of respect.
Mm-hmm. Amy, I want to segue back to Rig-to-reef, but any final thoughts on Tonga from a solution standpoint of what can be done there?
Well, I think like with any documentary film, in our experience, you go somewhere and you think you're going to tell one story. And we thought we were going to go there and tell the story of how successful it's been, this transition from hunting the whales to ecotourism. And yes, that transition has been successful. But the other story that kind of came out of that was, how vulnerable these whales were and how vulnerable that island nation was. And I think it is a silver lining because it shows it can be successfully done. You can transition successfully to ecotourism, but it's a long road and it's a challenging road. And we were very much watching a culture that was evolving in that moment to accommodate and grow. And they were having growing pains like any other, significant shift is. I mean, they only stopped hunting whales 50 years ago. So,
right.
So many of the people that we interacted with, they talked about and they missed eating the whales. They remembered the recipes that they ate growing up. And so from that perspective, it was really a culture that was actively in transition. But it was a silver lining because it showed that it could be done. And any local you talked to had respect for those whales, and any local you talked to were excited that you were there to swim with the whales and experience it from that perspective. And it showed and demonstrated how successful that has been.
That's great to hear. Yeah, what if they were just like, go away, white people, we don't want you here,
Yeah.
That would not have been good. And by the way, we will share the link to your documentary. I watched it a couple times, and I could just sit and watch people swimming with whales for hours and hours. So it's really beautiful, and it really tells the story in great detail of what you're talking about. And speaking of ecotourism, and like I said, segueing back to Rig-to-reefs, you completed an expedition to the Sea Ventures dive reef off the coast of Malaysia, and the purpose was to research, document, and explore the implications of repurposing an oil and gas structure into a dive resort. Now that is a unique concept. What did you discover about the difference in marine biodiversity and abundance on rigs versus natural reefs?
Yes, well, that was a really exciting adventure we went on back, now, almost 4 years ago. And kind of how Emily mentioned, you think you're going to go somewhere and tell a certain story, and then you end up telling something different. Well, when we arrived on this Sea Ventures dive rig off of Mabul, Malaysia, it's a jack-up rig. So it's a little different from the structures we see here in California that have many beams and intersecting cross beams that create nooks and crannies for marine life to grow. Rather, a jack-up rig is something that's just got 4 legs or 4 or 6 legs, and they use it to move it from area to area. So it's kind of a less complex structure. So we arrived. It was so fascinating to see that they had repurposed the upper decks into living quarters. These structures are massive. Some in the Gulf of Mexico have bowling alleys and movie theaters. They house operators for months at a time. People are out there living and monitoring the structure. So you have to have facilities, a big kitchen, things like that. So it's kind of already set up to serve as a resort or a place for people to visit. But the truth is that it's a very rustic environment. We were taking saltwater showers and, in sort of tight quarters, but we were so excited to dive. And when we rolled over, I was expecting to dive into the water and just see the same sort of marine life we have here in California, abundance, a lot of fish species, but that's not what I found. Rather, these beams did not have a lot of life growing on them at all. And while there were schooling species of fish around, I was really surprised to not see more coral growth. And the reason for this is that we were actually in a muck water environment. So the island of Mabul is famous for muck diving, or basically sandy, silty mud, people going to look at these small cryptic species that are living in the mud environment. So the interesting thing about any platform or any artificial reef is that its purpose is to mimic the environment in which it's been placed. So if you place it in a muck water environment, that's the type of species you're going to see growing there. So while we were really shocked to not have kind of this initial, pop of color of marine life, when we compared the platform to the surrounding environment, we did a whole bunch of ecological surveys while we were there. What we found is that they were actually really comparable. It just wasn't the type of environment we had been expecting. And so that was a really exciting trip for us. We also got to go to the island of Sipadan, which if you're a big dive fan, it's kind of a famous seamount that was, several miles away from the Sea Ventures dive rig. But the seamount comes out of the ocean floor and acts as an incredible place for the currents upwelling, lots of coral reef, and lots of animals and big fish species there. So that was a really cool dive experience for us as well.
Did you say they have bowling alleys on these oil rigs?
Yeah.
I expected to learn about, coral reefs and things today. I didn't expect to learn that. That's incredible.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. Yeah, and saltwater showers. You took salty hair, don't care to a whole new level there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, ironically, the day we left, they installed their desal plant.
The day we left.
So go figure.
That's awesome. And Emily, what conclusions did you reach around sustainability of an ecotourism resort?
What was really interesting about the Sea Ventures dive rig and the area that surrounded it was the unique juxtaposition that we encountered between Sipadan Island, which is hands down the most unbelievable diving I've ever done in my life, to Mabul Island, which is a home to the sea gypsies, which is a culture that rarely ever goes on land. They have these huts and boats that they live in off the island, and incredibly, incredibly, incredibly poor. And the level of trash that was on the island was unlike something I've never seen before ever in my travels, but they don't have a waste management system. This is an area that, went from literally using banana leaves to using plastics and not having an opportunity to let it degrade. A banana leaf degrades. And, I think a lot of people would visit there and think, oh, this is bad. This is the people's fault. But it's not. They don't have the resources that we do. And unfortunately, those of us that do have the resources still pollute our oceans. And so I think that was like, a unique underlayer that was running, a unique current that was running while we were doing this experience. And a lot of the locals worked on the Sea Ventures dive rig and took a lot of pride in that structure, and had a lot of knowledge as to the cryptic species that we were seeing. And I mean, definitely coming up from that first dive after going down there was kind of like, well, that wasn't what we expected. We thought there'd be a lot of marine life there. But then it turned out the artificial reef was doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. It was mimicking what the marine life looked like in that surrounding environment. So it was a learning curve for us. And, it also taught us that this type of structure, which is very simple, no beams or cross beams, and one that was placed in a very specific type of environment, was behaving the way it would be expected to. And that's what makes siting studies and selecting the appropriate platform to be reefed so important, and it really drove that point home for us.
What was the island you mentioned the sea gypsies are at?
It's called Mabul Island, and the sea gypsy tribe there is called the Bauja.
Wow, I want to research that. That sounds incredible. Wow. Anything else you want to share on ecotourism? I wanted to talk about your ROVs next, but I want to make sure we're complete on that topic. Anything else you would share on the sustainability? And is this something that we could go, could be a normal thing that we would go vacation on a rig?
I think the idea works in unique settings. I think it worked there. I don't necessarily know if it would work everywhere. I think there are unique opportunities to use these platforms as research stations. As Amber said, they have incredible living quarters. So what if they house scientists and you could be 500 miles offshore doing your research? And, ecotourism, like anything else, also has a dark underbelly. So I think it's something that could come out, and it could be a good idea in certain locations, but I don't really see an ecotourism hotel coming offshore California. Let's put it that way.
Probably not here. All right, let's talk ROVs. You are testing remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, to better understand the value as platforms, as reefs. And I think you're going down like 7,000 feet, right? Which is amazing. What are the objectives of this project, and what are you discovering?
Yeah, so ROVs are like little underwater drone. They help us go to depths that we could never reach as divers. So they're an incredible tool. And for a while, we were Deep Trekker ambassadors. So Deep Trekker is an ROV manufacturer actually based out of Canada. And they sent us a little drone that ROV, that we could use. And we really loved this technology and thought of applying it to some of the research we were doing on these oil platforms. And our purpose is really to gather this footage and be able to share it with a greater audience, because these ROVs are equipped with cameras, and they also have a whole bunch of other tools that we can put on them. But the camera is one of the greatest aspects because it allows us to see these environments and show them live stream from our boat back to classrooms on shore. Take them with us as we're exploring underwater. And so we're really excited to, I think we're headed out to an oil platform here in the next couple months. We've been testing our protocols and our maneuverability skills in a pool. Then we were in Mission Bay. Then we've done a couple trips off of Huntington Beach and a couple off of La Jolla as well. So the better we get at using this tool, the more effective we're going to be. And our hope is to take it on an artificial reef on an oil platform soon.
Nice. Yeah, when I interviewed Paul Watson again, he mentioned that the most powerful weapon in the world is a camera. And I have one quote on my computer screen right here. It says, "Make visible what without you might perhaps never have been seen." So imagine going down 7,000 feet, you're seeing things no one's ever seen before. Emily, what would you add in terms of the goal of working with these ROVs?
Well, we started working with ROVs with our for-profit company, actually, when we were doing ecological value assessments on structures that were 7,000 feet below the surface. And what we realized as we were doing this is how lucky we were as scientists, because to be a scientist and go down and take an ROV down to 7,000 feet is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Most people will never be able to do that. And yet we were figuring out a way to work with these companies to collect this information and this data about the marine life that's found there. And, what I learned about the deep sea is that it's, the abundance levels or the number of individual fish is very low, but the biodiversity, the number of species, is some of the highest on the planet, which is wild. And they're also incredibly weird looking and unique species. And it kind of opened our eyes to the power of these ROVs, because not only did it allow us to explore spaces that as a recreational diver you can't, but we also had a video log of it. We could go back and revisit it and count the species and look at what we saw and make observations. And so we started thinking about California. If you're not a diver, or a free diver, you've probably never been to California's offshore platforms, and you probably have no idea what it looks like below the surface. And it's all well and good to talk about the marine life there, but seeing is believing. And so we got this idea of, well, what if we start taking these ROVs, these little ROVs, they don't go down to 7,000 feet, unfortunately, but they go down pretty deep, and we can capture a lot of information that we can share with the public, take the public virtually diving with us on the platforms, which was kind of the impetus for this project.
It's interesting hearing you guys talk. You guys light up when we talk about swimming with humpback whales. You light up when just the thought of just diving, just being in the water, which leads to my next question. I'm curious, how did you each get started on your path as ocean conservationists? I'm curious, what inspired you? Who inspired you to do what you do?
Well, I grew up in Southern California, and the ocean has always been kind of in my backyard. I was very fortunate to have that growing up, and it's been kind of a consistent source of curiosity. And I've always, had a deep love, and I always had so much fun at the ocean. It's always just been a really great place for me. And when I went to begin my academic career up at UC Berkeley, I was really wanting to understand more about about the oceans and learn about it. And I was really inspired by so many of my professors and some of the research and volunteer work that I did in my undergrad. And from there, honestly, the rest is history. I've just sort of been stuck with it.
I can relate to that. And Emily, how about you? I've been to New Hampshire. I looked really hard. I didn't see an ocean there. There's a big lake, but definitely not an ocean. Who and what inspired you?
Well, I hate to tell you this, but we have 13 miles of coastline, and we are very proud of it. And I grew up on an island, actually, offshore of New Hampshire, on that 13 miles of coastline, Newcastle Island.
Okay, I went to the wrong part of New Hampshire then.
Well, the rest,
I didn't go far enough east.
98% of New Hampshire does not touch ocean, but I was very fortunate to grow up on the portion that does. And I always loved the ocean. Grew up taking, buckets home of everything I found, crabs, mussels, and trying to keep them alive as long as possible, which learned very quickly they don't stay alive very often if you take them home. But I grew up, in a family of divers. My mom was a diver. My dad was a dive master. And so my brother and we got certified very young. So I think I was 12 when I was certified, and was very fortunate to grow up diving in a lot of unique locations. But I never met any other women divers or, even really that many divers at all, probably because I was living in New Hampshire. But when I went to graduate school, I actually found that I found a lot of inspiration in the other women that were in my graduating class. And I think that's because I knew a lot of male role model figures in the ocean space. I grew up with Jacques Cousteau and emulating him and wanting to do, his level of exploration, but I never met any other women that were in the ocean sciences. And I met so many unique women at Scripps that they really inspired me. And it was all of a sudden I had a whole group of friends that were also women divers. And I drew a lot of inspiration from that. And I was also very excited by that. And a lot of those women, Amber included, have become lifelong best friends.
And business partners.
And
That's
business partners,
incredible.
all of the.
Yeah, now you get to hang with the Sylvia Earls of the world. I interviewed Danny. You guys know Danny Washington?
We do know Danny, yeah. I've met her a few times.
She's amazing. I got to interview her like a month ago. Wow. So we find ourselves, like I said at the beginning, in an all hands on deck moment in time. Emily, this one's for you. How important is it for you to inspire other young people? I'll call you young people still. That's okay, right?
Yeah.
How important is it to inspire other young people to follow their passions for protecting the ocean? Or are you just kind of hoping to lead by example?
I think it's incredibly important to introduce younger people to the ocean sciences. Like I said, I really didn't know anybody else working in that space growing up. I didn't have any family members that were biologists or working in the ocean space. And not even in college, I didn't encounter anybody. I started meeting more people after, but now Amber and I, we do so much education and outreach, live streaming into classrooms, teaching school children about not just the oceans, but what jobs exist in the oceans. And I think back, I wish I knew that at the time. I really didn't know what jobs existed in the ocean, or maybe I just thought you would work at a zoo or an aquarium. I didn't realize there were toxicologists and people that work in offshore energy and people that were consultants and people that were artists. I didn't realize how many jobs there were. And I think really, when you grow up and you don't get exposed to that, you don't really see an outlet for yourself to work in the ocean space, especially if you grow up not being near an ocean. You think to yourself, that's something that's so foreign that I'll probably never have access to, and it really doesn't impact my life. So I think being able to share that information, and not just share, information about the ocean, but share what career tracks exist within the ocean space is so inspiring and helpful. And I know I can speak from personal experience that I wish I had had that. And now that I've been in this space and I've met so many incredible women, it's like, gosh, everybody deserves their own TV show to talk about what they're doing, because it's so cool.
It is so cool. And Amber, you are the happy mama of a beautiful new baby. How has motherhood altered your perspective and your focus in your work?
Wow. Well, that's a good question. I don't know if it really has altered it very much. I think that, it's just another part of life. But the beautiful thing about expanding families is that you realize that our generations are are moving forward. We're growing on this. Our lifelines are going to go much longer than, my life here on this planet. And so just kind of the importance of legacy and leaving behind solutions, because I don't think I can leave behind an ocean that's better than what was here when I was born, but leaving behind a legacy of solutions and how you can work together and find ways to preserve and protect the ocean moving forward. So I think that's definitely something I try to work on every day, is what are the solutions that are available to us so that we can work hard to, improve what we have with our oceans.
Absolutely. And speaking of legacy, as we mentioned, you were recently interviewed by Her Deepness, Dr. Sylvia Earle. Probably fair to assume she's a mutual hero of the three of us. She's got a solid 50 years on each of you and has done so much to raise awareness and love and compassion as a scientist and also a storyteller. In your wildest dreams, what kind of impact do you each hope to make with your work in the next several decades?
Well, I think what's most incredible about Sylvia is that she came about as a female scientist at a time when there really wasn't that many. And even today, when people tell me they don't know who Sylvia Earle is, I'm like, how do you not know who Sylvia Earle is? Because in a lot of spaces, people don't know who she is. They know Jane Goodall, but they don't know who she is. And I think to myself, I'm like, wow, she was so incredible. Like, I wish I could promote her and elevate her the way that people know Jane Goodall, because to me, she is the pinnacle of what you hope to be as a scientist. And I say that because not only has she done incredible scientific work, but she's also projected it. She's shared it with the world, and she's put herself out there and taken, gone deeper than anybody had ever gone before, explored further than anybody had gone before. She, put herself out there to really share the science that she was doing. She wasn't someone that was, bundled away and not sharing it with anybody. And I think that's something Amber and I really seek to emulate, is to not only do the science, but share it with people. And really highlight areas of our oceans that really are overlooked. People don't think about oil platforms as something that would be something worth saving, but they are something worth saving. And I think if it was to be a legacy that we could leave behind, it would be thinking differently about how we manage our ocean resources and thinking creatively for long-term solutions for our oceans.
Would you say filmmaking is a part of that? Obviously, Sylvia's Mission Blue, which we've probably all seen 100 times, was amazing. You made a couple short documentaries. Is there a bigger filmmaking goal that you each have?
Yeah, I think we really do hope to make more films in the future. Our foundation focuses on areas of the environment where we intersect with industry. So whether that be oil and gas or ecotourism, maybe aquaculture, fisheries, there are so many different avenues where we can find these sort of intersections and tell the stories of success there. As what we find is that it's really easy to get depressed when you think about the state of our oceans. Yeah. And we hope to have an optimistic story that even though we've used our oceans, it's degraded in so many ways, the oceans are resilient and they've rebounded. And in some cases, they're thriving reefs below oil and gas platforms. Who could believe that? So telling these stories, highlighting them, whether it's through our research or through filmmaking, is going to be really important and a powerful part of our legacy.
One of the things that's been so inspiring for me, as you know, I've interviewed so many great people on this podcast, the amount of optimism in the face of such potential depression when you think about the state of the planet. Everybody's doing the work, everybody remains optimistic, and I think that optimism and spreading that is so important. That's why I'm doing the show, and I appreciate you guys being here and sharing so much today. You mentioned your foundation. My last question, what's the best way that people can support the Blue Latitudes Foundation?
Well, you can check out our website, www.bluelatitudesfoundation.org. There we post all about our projects, things we're working on, our community science initiative with the ROV we're hoping to involve members of the public with, so we'll be posting on there. You can get involved with our newsletter on there as well. We also have a petition on the Patagonia website right now that's in order to make Rig-to-reefs a reality in California. You can also access that through our website. So our website is really the portal for everything. We're on social media, Instagram at Blue Latitudes Foundation, and we also have a YouTube mini-series called Science CTV, where we post a lot of our expeditions, our research, and different highlight different other women in STEM on there.
Excellent. So we will share links to everything that you just mentioned and more. I appreciate you guys so much. I'll give you each the final word, and then we will wrap up. Amber.
Well, thank you so much for having us. This was a really wonderful experience. So happy to be here. And looking forward to keeping up the good work of protecting our oceans.
Thank you. Emily, how about you?
No, we really appreciate being here with you, Rich, and we've really enjoyed this conversation. It's always inspiring to talk with another person passionate about the ocean and just talk all things ocean. So thanks so much for having us.
Well, talk is great, but let's definitely set the intention and make a plan to get out on that ocean together sometime soon. Deal?
Definitely.
All right. That's our show, everybody. Amber and Emily, thank you so much for your love, for your passion, your heart, and your soul, for who you are and the work that you do in the world. We'll see you next time, everybody. Thanks.